This segment is the fourth and final segment of Module 5A. This segment focuses on the third step of the SLO development process, choose assessments and set the growth target. If you have not completed segments 1, 2, and 3 yet, please exit this presentation now and complete those segments prior to returning to this segment.
We are moving right along and have now reached step 3, choose assessments and set the growth target. In this step, we will finish completing the SLO template by addressing the assessments, growth targets, and rationale for growth target components. First, teachers will need to determine how they will assess student growth. As a reminder, assessments used on SLOs do not need to be pencil and paper tests. However, they must meet specific criteria, including the following. Assessments should be reviewed by content experts. Assessments should be aligned to content standards identified in your SLO. Assessments should have sufficient stretch. And assessments should be valid and reliable. If you need to review any of these terms, please review the materials from Module 2 or consult the ODE provided document entitled Guidance for Selecting Appropriate Assessments. At this point, I'd like to highlight 2 additional considerations regarding assessments. When appropriate, teachers should consider using the same assessment as colleagues who teach the same course or subject. Doing so will increase comparability across SLOs. For example, if all 4th grade teachers teach mixed ability science classes using the same curriculum throughout the district, having one assessment that all 4th grade science teachers administer can help ensure that these SLOs are comparable across teachers. However, if a teacher on the 9th grade mathematics team teaches accelerated mathematics that follows the 10th grade curriculum and the rest of the team teaches courses that follow the 9th grade curriculum, then the accelerated mathematics teacher would need a different assessment than his or her colleagues. In addition, make sure the time required to administer and score the assessment is reasonable to avoid overburdening the students. Turn now to handout 5A.10, which contains information on the assessments available to Mrs. Wilson. Select the assessment you think will be most appropriate, or if needed, note that Mrs. Wilson and her team will need to create a new assessment. Please remember that ODE strongly recommends that no teacher create an assessment in isolation. Now you are ready to complete the assessment component of your SLO template. Providing sufficient detail in your description here will help the reviewer determine if your assessment meets the criteria on the SLO template checklist. Initially, the teacher will probably be asked to submit the assessment along with your SLO for approval. In the future, the district may create an approved list of assessments for use in SLOs. If this occurs, teachers will no longer need to submit the assessment along with the SLO template. Because the reviewer may not be familiar with the assessment you are using, ODE recommends that teachers include some key information. In the description of the assessment, the teacher will want to include the name and the type of the assessment. Some assessments are easily recognized, whereas others are not as well known. Please include a description of the format of the assessment and the types of questions. The teacher should also describe who reviewed the assessment and/or how he or she knows the assessment aligns with the course standards. When writing Mrs. Wilson's SLO, you will need to include some additional information in the assessment section. You should describe how you know the assessment has sufficient stretch, meaning that it will capture the performance of students who are high performing and those who are low performing. If Mrs. Wilson will be combining multiple assessments, you will need to explain how you will combine them, such as by averaging the scores, adding them, or weighting them. Finally, you may want to include information about how the assessment will be administered and scored, especially if Mrs. Wilson will be using a performance assessment. Please pause the presentation now to complete the assessment portion of your SLO template. Remember to review the SLO template checklist while writing so that you can make sure that you are meeting all the requirements of this component. Resume the recording when you are ready to proceed. Which assessment did you select and what details did you include? If you selected the course post-assessment, which was best aligned to both sets of standards and was not created by an individual teacher, you should have included the following information. You should have noted that the district science team created the assessment and that both the district science coordinator and school assessment coordinator reviewed the assessment. This information provides information about the likelihood that the assessment is valid and reliable. You should have noted that the assessment is aligned to appropriate standards. In order to demonstrate how you know this assessment has enough stretch, you could have noted that no student scored above a 60 on the pre-assessment, so all students have at least 40 points to grow. At this point, you may be feeling like this process is taking a long time. Keep in mind that the SLO development process will get easier over time as you become more familiar with it. Hang in there, you are nearing the completion of your first SLO. The second part of Step 3 is setting the growth targets. We talked at length about growth targets in Module 3. As a reminder, here are some critical things to remember when setting growth targets. In a class or course level SLO, all students must have a growth target. When setting the targets, teacher must use the information available to them to determine the expected performance of your students. This information may include baseline data, trend data, and specified expectations from vendors or the district. When possible and appropriate, targets should be tiered or differentiated so that all students can show developmentally appropriate growth. Targets should be rigorous yet attainable. For example, ambitious yet attainable targets in some cases may expect students to show slightly more than a year's expected growth. However, expecting students to show 3 or 4 years of growth in 1 year is rigorous yet unrealistic. You may remember from Module 3 that a one-size-fits-all approach to setting growth targets does not exist. But if you keep these things in mind, you will be well on your way to constructing appropriate growth targets. If you need to, exit the module now and review your materials from Module 3 before returning. If you're ready to set your growth targets, turn back now to Mrs. Wilson's data and use the data available to you to set growth targets. If possible, share the growth targets that you have set with your colleagues and get their input on their appropriateness. Resume the recording when you are ready. Okay, ready to fill in the growth target component of the SLO template? In the growth target section, you will need to include the growth targets, usually in the form of a table. To reduce the amount of inference required from the observer and to minimize the likelihood that the SLO will be sent back to you for revisions, you also may want to include a brief description of how you set the growth targets using baseline data and how you know they are ambitious and developmentally appropriate for students. Including the baseline data in the table could be very beneficial here. Pause the recording now to complete this section and check yourself using the SLO template checklist. When you are finished, press play to move to the next slide. In this section, Mrs. Wilson sufficiently explains the growth targets. The reviewer needs to make a judgment about whether the assessments used in the past and the assessment used in 2012-13 are similar enough that the trend data can be used to inform the growth targets. It sounds like the assessment was only slightly modified, and Mrs. Wilson provides an explanation as to why she thinks these targets are rigorous. One concern might be whether the targets are still attainable, given that this year's assessment is more challenging. The other criteria of the growth targets section of the SLO template checklist have been met. All students in the class have an SLO. Mrs. Wilson used baseline data to inform her growth targets and used trend data to determine appropriate growth. She tiered the targets so that all students may demonstrate growth. You might have decided to structure your SLO targets differently. For example, you might have focused on the ranges of post-assessment scores more than these targets do. Regardless of how you set your targets must be clearly explained. Reviewers need to be able to make an informed decision regarding whether your approach to setting growth targets was reasonable given the data available to you. The final section of the SLO template is the rationale. This piece ties the rest of the SLO together by containing a strong justification for why you constructed your SLO the way that you did. When writing the rationale, pretend you are being interviewed. You may need to infer or pretend a little bit here since you are only pretending to be Mrs. Wilson, but do your best to answer these questions. Think about how Mrs. Wilson would respond to the questions on the slide. and then combine your answers to create a coherent justification for your SLO. Ready? Think of your answers as I read this slide. How did you identify student needs and determine appropriate growth targets? Think about what data you analyzed at the beginning of this module to first identify student needs. How does this SLO address student needs? Explain how if students meet their targets, they will have shown significant progress in an area of need. And why is it important that students master the content of this SLO? In other words, why does this matter? If students do not master this content or skill, what might happen? How do the targets align with broader school and district goals? Think about how your SLO aligns with your district's instructional priorities for the year, your district's continuous improvement plan, your school's improvement plan, or district or school initiatives. Finally, how do you know that these targets are appropriate for Mrs. Wilson's students? Think about how you set your growth targets and the information you use to inform the targets. Think about the data you used and any other information, such as expected growth information from a vendor or district, to determine what expectation would be rigorous yet appropriate. Think about how the targets require all students to demonstrate growth, and how the targets move the lowest performing students toward proficiency. Now that you've thought about the rationale, compose your justification in the SLO template. Check yourself using the SLO template checklist. Pause here and return when you have completed your rationale for the growth target. In the rationale, you should have constructed an argument for why it is essential students learn this information and these skills. You should have described how you used pre-assessment and trend data to set the growth targets and provided justification for why the targets are developmentally appropriate. Handout 5A.3 contains some information about district and school goals. In your rationale, you should have connected these goals to your SLO, such as by describing how the SLO is aligned with goals of improving use of formative assessments and using assessments that capture the full cognitive demand of the course. Finally, you should have provided an explanation for how you know these targets are rigorous yet attainable. Congratulations! At this point, you have completed a draft of an SLO. At this point, you have completed steps 1, 2, and 3 of the SLO development process. The next step is to have a colleague review the SLO if possible and make sure that your SLO satisfies all the applicable criteria in the checklist. Once the SLO is in its final draft, teachers should submit it. Submission procedures will vary by district, so please check with your local administrator to find out more about the submission procedure.
In this module, Carol Morbitzer walked you through writing an SLO. As you continue writing SLOs, remember that the SLO template checklist is a critical resource to use throughout the process. In addition, if you have additional questions related to SLOs, please contact the SLO Help Desk at the URL listed on this slide. The Help Desk service enables you to email questions about SLOs and then receive answers within a few days. Keep in mind that requests to review SLOs will not be honored, as SLO approval is completed at the local level. The next module, Module 6, will address calibration and will focus on the SLO approval process. In the meantime, happy SLO writing!